Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks for tuning in today. If you'd like to support my channel, please check the link in the upper right hand corner to my Patreon page. So off the bat, I want to apologize for my absence in the last couple of months. In August, I was just on vacation all month and had no time, really, unfortunately, at all. And in September, I was just really busy with work. So very little time to even play Magic, much less time to sit down and record videos and upload for you guys. So again, apologies for my lack of content, but I wanted to take a minute today to make a video because in the few moments that I have had to sit down and play in the last month or so, it's been really exciting. Ixalan came out, and as you guys know, one of the main tribes in Ixalan is Merfolk. So I was watching spoiler season very closely, on the edge of my seat, trying to just pray that we get something to have fun with in Modern Merfolk. So unfortunately, Merfolk is a blue-green tribe in Ixalan. It's not a mono-blue tribe. A lot of us, from the announcement of that fact, were pretty bummed out, and especially during spoiler season, as all these cool Merfolk were being revealed, we found ourselves saying, oh, if this was only in blue instead of green, it would be so amazing for Modern Merfolk. And I totally understand that sentiment. We've come as Modern Merfolk players to think of splashing a color as just fundamentally suboptimal. But that, that really comes from the testing that has been done up to this point, right? I mean, we haven't seen any real successful blue-red lists, any real successful blue-black lists. The only thing that's really had any success so far is the blue-white deck, splashing white. But the vast majority of the Modern Merfolk community considers that suboptimal because a lot of the card options that white gives us access to, things like Rest in Peace in the sideboard and Path to Exile in the main, have really solid alternatives in mono blue. So, I mean, Rest in Peace, the alternative to that is just Relic of Progenitus, right? It does a pretty good job of keeping the opponent's graveyard empty. And Path to Exile, before even considering the fact that we have Dismember as a viable alternative as creature removal, Path to Exile directly works against some of the goals of Modern Merfolk. We run Curse Catchers to tax the opponent's spells, forcing them to have more mana on board to effectively resolve their spells through Curse Catcher. Every time we cast a Path to Exile, we're giving the opponent another land, effectively canceling out the effect of one of our Curse Catchers, directly working against our game plan. Even more directly working against our game plan is whenever we cast a Spreading Seas, we're trying to reduce the opponent's access to their colors. But if you cast a Path to Exile on their creature, you are giving them more access to their colors. So Path to Exile, obviously not the best choice for Merfolk, works against our plan and requires us to splash a color. So totally reasonable that up until now, the community has considered splashing a color to be suboptimal in Modern Merfolk, and I totally agreed with that sentiment. But that being said, when new cards are printed, we have to reevaluate whether that position is still true or not. I mean, imagine that Wizards printed a white Merfolk True Name Nemesis, right? I mean, we would splash white. We would have to. We would be required to, because True Name Nemesis is just a broken card, and we need it in our deck. We'd figure out the mana base. We'd make it happen. So we didn't get a True Name Nemesis in Ixalan, but we did get a couple of really powerful cards. So here on the left, you have Comenius Speaker as a 1-drop, and on the right here, you have Merfolk Branchwalker, 2-drop. Before I get into the specifics of these two cards, I'm going to sort of discuss just for a moment how I came to this particular list right here, which is definitely the most powerful brew that I've come across while testing out a bunch of different approaches to playing a blue-green Merfolk deck. Now, I wasn't sure, I'm still not sure if blue-green is going to be the sort of way of the future. I think that Rivals of Ixalan when it's printed is going to give us even more merfolk to test with, and it's going to take at least another month or two to sort of really figure out if this is a better approach than mono blue. But I've been having a ton of fun testing it. So when I began trying out blue-green, the first thing I tried out was Collected Company. Now this is a card that people have been trying to figure out how to make work in Modern Merfolk since way before we had any idea that Ixalan was going to be a thing and that there were going to be merfolk in it. Unfortunately, when I tested Collected Company, I just found it really, really didn't work very well for two reasons that seem sort of obvious after I actually ran it through a league. First of all, we have way too many 2-drops. We've got a bunch of 1-drops. And Collected Company just doesn't get a ton of value. When you play Collected Company in a deck like Elves or in a deck like Bant Humans, you have so many value 3-drops that you can hit. In Elves, you have Izori, you have Archdruid. Just even hitting Monodorks is great because it makes your next Collected Companies and Court of Callings that much easier to cast. But for Merfolk, when you cast a Collected Company, it resolves and you get a Harbinger of the Tides and a Curse Catcher. Was it really worth 4 mana and a card to get a Harbinger and a Curse Catcher onto the table at instant speed? It really didn't feel good. So the first reason that Collected Company is suboptimal in Modern Merfolk is just our density of 2-drops. It doesn't get the value that Collected Company is designed to get. You want to get 5 or 6 mana out of creatures when you hit Collected Company optimally, but that really is just never ever going to happen with Modern Merfolk, or extremely rarely. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we tend to play virtually all non-creature spells in our sideboard. You've got counter spells, you've got removal, you've got artifacts, and when you start jamming your deck in games 2 and 3 full of non-creature spells, Collected Company just gets that much worse, right? We've already got Ether Vials and Spreading Seas on top of things like Dismember in the main deck. When you start adding in 5, 6, 7 other non-creatures into the deck, and you cast a Collected Company, the chance of whiffing and just hitting nothing or hitting a single 1-drop or something like that, an unsuccessful Collected Company can just really end a game, right? I mean, if you put so much hope in what you hit off of that card, that when you end up whiffing, it's like a punch in the gut, and it can really just lose you a game instantaneously. So our sideboard approach is really, it doesn't mesh well with Collected Company, and we're not the kind of deck like, say, Devoted Company, or any of these sort of toolbox decks dating back to when Pod was a thing, that runs a lot of creatures in the sideboard. Things like extra Khazali Pride Mages, things like extra Scavenging Ooze to deal with graveyards, Kitchen Finks to gain more life, maybe Selfless Spirit to help you against board wipes. We're not running Chord of Calling to go and grab those creatures at instant speed. So a Collected Company just felt like a square peg for a round hole in our deck. It just felt like it didn't fit. But while running Collected Company, obviously the first decision was to chop off Master of Waves because he's a 4-drop and can't get hit by Collected Company. It also made sense to chop Master of Waves because we've got a bunch of green Devotion in the deck now. And imagine casting a 4-drop Master of Waves with only green creatures on the board. I mean, it doesn't feel very good. Master of Waves is only really... it only really gets a lot of value when you have a bunch of other creatures and Devotion on the board, like Spreading Seas. When you cast it for just 1 token, it doesn't really feel like it's worth 4 mana. So Master of Waves got chopped as soon as I took the blue-green approach. I had chopped out Ether Vials to be replaced with Noble Hierarchs, which in theory would get the Collected Companies online faster and give us more hits for Collected Companies, since Hierarch is a creature, whereas Ether Vial is not. In practice, while it did resolve an early Collected Company or two for me, having a Hierarch on the board early in the game, it just gives you more things like Noble Hierarchs to hit on Collected Companies, which is not great. Who wants to hit a 0/1 off of their Collected Company, right? Nobody wants that. So I didn't like Collected Company. The next shift after that was to cut Collected Company out of the deck and just keep the curve at 3. Again, getting rid of Master of Waves because of the green Devotion, but keeping a playset of Regeries and a couple of Kiras in the deck. But as I tested that, I found that the aggressive nature of Comenius Speaker as a 1-drop 2/2 really made the deck feel like it wanted to get off to these explosive starts. And so Marorigiri as a 3-drop, and especially Kira as a 3-drop non-Merfolk, began to feel a little bit clunky. So in the end, I tried cutting Rigiri, and once you've cut Rigiri and Master of Waves, 3-drops and 4-drops that require a huge investment of mana, I mean, huge for Modern Merfolk, right? 3-drops and 4-drops are pretty expensive for us. If you're running those guys, it makes sense to have something like Kira in the board, in the deck to protect them, right? You want to protect your mana investment. But if you've only got 1-drops and 2-drops in the deck, then Kira becomes much less important. So cut Master of Waves because of Green Devotion, cut Rigiri because he's just kind of a turn slow for the approach that the new cards seem to be pulling the deck in. And then cut Kira because she just seemed a little bit unnecessary. So at this point, I've arrived at this list, current blue-green Simic Modern Merfolk. The thing that replaced Rigiri was Metallic Mimic, who kind of acts as a lord, but I'll get to that. I'm going to take the list from left to right, starting with the manabase, and then just going through the 1-drops, 2-drops, and then non-creature spells and the sideboard. So looking at the manabase, you can see that there's only 18 lands. One of the cool things about running a deck with just 1-drops, 2-drops, and a playset of Ether Vials is that we can get by just playing 18 lands, which obviously gives us extra spots for spells. So at the top, you've got 2 breeding pools. These are really important to be able to fetch to get green mana early in the game. Turn 1, if you have a Comenius Speaker, you're going to need green mana to get that guy onto the board. Interesting to note that if you do play Speaker off of Breeding Pool is an island, and it immediately turns Comenius Speaker into a 2/2. So right off the bat, getting on the table as a 2/2. You do want 2 breeding pools in the deck because if you get the first one down and the opponent ghost quarters it, you're going to want to be able to fetch more green mana. We do have some other green mana in the deck in Botanical Sanctum, but you can't fetch that. So important to have access to 2 breeding pools to turn on all your Fetchlands. Next, we've got 3 islands. Might seem like a tiny amount of islands, but again, you do need access to green mana in the deck. So it's important that you don't run too many lands that only give you access to colorless or blue mana. So 3 islands, I've sort of, after testing, come to the conclusion this is the correct amount. You can go and fetch these. Actually, against Blood Moon decks, it's really important that you go and get the islands out as quickly as possible in the event that the opponent does resolve a Blood Moon. So 3 islands, 2 breeding pools as our fetchable lands. Then after that, you can see we've got 6 Fetchlands. Misty Rainforest, obviously the clear choice since it gets green or blue. But really, all of our fetchable lands have blue in it. So any fetch land with blue in its color identity, I don't know if that's the right word, not color identity because lands are colorless, but any fetch land that can grab a blue land is going to be good because any of them let you get a breeding pool or an island. The reason that I have a sort of diverse selection of fetches is, if their opponent seizes us and sees the Misty Rainforest, they can play a Pithing Needle and name Misty Rainforest. All right, then we can't activate our Misty Rainforest anymore. Hopefully, we can draw into other fetch lands. We have Flooded Strands and Polluted Deltas. If you just ran a playset of Misty Rainforests and the opponent named Misty Rainforest with Pithing Needle, then they might potentially shut you off of like a quarter of your lands, which can really set you back. So you do want at least a couple different types of fetches in the deck. 6 fetch lands has, after testing, again, sort of come to seem like the correct number. It's a pretty low cost to pay 1 and go and grab an island. And you're not drawing all 6 of these in any given match. It just gives you the flexibility of fetching green if you really need it, or just getting an island if that's all you need. Okay, so past the fetch lands, we've got a full playset of Botanical Sanctum. This card is perfect in this particular build of Simic Merfolk because we aim to accomplish pretty much our entire game plan like in the first 3 or 4 turns. The goal with this list is to reach a critical mass of creatures by turn 4, turn 5, and just win the game. So Botanical Sanctum, basically a tropical island for the first 3 turns of the game. comes in untapped, gives you access to green, gives you access to blue. The one downside of Botanical Sanctum, and it's actually a tiny one, you really don't have to worry about it, is that it is not actually an island. So it doesn't turn on Comenius Speaker's +1/+1. Now, imagine turn 1, you play Botanical Sanctum into turn 1 Comenius Speaker. Next turn, you're either going to play an island, or you're going to fetch for an island, or you're going to play another Merfolk off of, say a Mutavault. Once you've got another Merfolk on the table, Speaker becomes a 1/1. Actually, a really cool thing that I found was I had that exact situation with a Botanical Sanctum and a Mutavault, and on turn 2, or maybe it was turn 3, I activated the Mutavault, and since I had no other Merfolk on board, actually Mutavault was a Merfolk, and Comenius Speaker saw that it was a Merfolk, so it went immediately from being a 1/1 to being a 2/2. So even just activating Mutavault turns on Speaker's +1/+1. So after playing a couple dozen matches with Speaker in the deck in one form or another, it's always a 2/2. You really don't have to worry about it not being a 2/2. So consider it a green Merfolk Shaman 2/2 for 1 mana, and that's pretty much how to evaluate it. After the Sanctums, we've got 3 Mutavaults. Now, in an 18 land 2-color mana base, I've just realized you cannot run a full playset of Mutavaults. It's way too greedy. You're not going to have your green mana. You're not going to have as much blue mana as you need. So after trimming down a couple lands, I realized one of the lands we have to trim is definitely a Mutavault. A notable exclusion is Cavern of Souls. For a little while, I was running 2 caverns in this list, but came across situations where I had sideboarded in Natural State and Dispel, and I only had a Cavern of Souls and a Mutavault as my only land. And you guys know Cavern of Souls can only cast creatures. It can't cast these kinds of spells that require blue and green mana. So again, with an 18 land, 2-color mana base, Cavern of Souls just seemed too greedy for me. There's going to be a lot more situations against a lot more decks where we need access to just pure colored mana to cast our sideboard cards. Then there are going to be situations where we're getting our creatures countered by blue-white control, for example. And in those situations, we often have Aether Vial on the board anyway. So I've trimmed Cavern of Souls, trimmed 1 Mutavault. So that's the mana base. It feels pretty solid at this point. Let me know if you guys have any thoughts or suggestions after some of your own testing. So moving on, we've got the 1-drops here. 4 Curse Catchers. For a little while when I was testing some of the collected company lists and lists that still had Regery and Kira in them, I had tried trimming a Curse Catcher to make room for other creatures, but in this list, running much lower to the ground, trying to maximize 1-drops and 2-drops, Curse Catchers back up to a full playset, which is excellent because it maintains some of the tempo orientation that Modern Merfolk has always enjoyed. You guys should know by now, Curse Catcher does a great job slowing down the opponent's instants and sorceries. The most important ones really are things like Anger of the Gods, which give us 1 extra turn to attack, and often that can make the difference in a game. So 4 Curse Catchers to get a creature on the board early, and the new card, Comenius Speaker. Now, I've talked about this one a little bit already. It's virtually always a 2/2. 1 green mana. Looking at the mana base, we've got the 2 Breeding Pools, 6 Fetchlands, that's 8, plus 4 Botanical Sanctums, that's 12. So 12 out of 18, that's 2/3 of our mana base, can give us green mana. So I found this mana base very comfortable for casting Comenius Speaker on turn 1 if we have it. And for those rare situations where we don't have the correct mana to get a Speaker onto the table, we've got Aether Vial in many of those situations so that we can just get Comenius Speaker out that way. The green mana, really not that much of a drawback so far. Every time I've encountered burn, I've won so far with this mana base. The aggressive nature of the deck really helps us just sort of explode and compete with the speed of the burn deck. Comenius Speaker actually sort of changes the game against burn a little bit, because if it comes down as a 2/2 on turn 1, if the opponent plays a Goblin Guide and attacks into us, we can just trade with it instantaneously. We don't have to let it get in for 1 hit, 2 hits, potentially 3 hits, getting too much value out of 1 Goblin Guide. Comenius Speaker trades with a guide, which is awesome. And even more awesome is if we play Comenius Speaker on the play, and the opponent plays a Monastery Swiftspear on their first turn, they can't even attack into it. So even though our game against Burn is hindered a little bit by the fact that we're taking damage from our lands, it's really improved by the addition of Speaker in the deck to slow down Burn's best hands, which are the ones with creatures in them. Trading with a Goblin Guide or just stonewalling a Monastery Swiftspear for a turn really works to our advantage. So I've been really happy with how this card plays. Comes down as a 2/2. If you play a Lord on turn 2, it swings as a 3/3. Play another Lord on turn 3, now you're swinging with a 4/4 Speaker and a 3/3 Lord. That's 7 damage, so you've done 3 plus 7. You've already done 10 damage by the end of turn 3. On turn 4, you don't have to play any other cards. You've got 4, 3, and 3 to do another 10 damage. So 3, 7, and 10 is exactly 20. So one of the super interesting aspects of adding Speaker to the deck as a 2/2 1-drop is that it gives us the opportunity to for a turn 4 kill with only a combination of 3 cards. Before the addition of Comenius Speaker, in order to get a turn 4 win, we had to have some combination of at least 4 cards, whether 3 creatures and a Mutavault or 4 creatures. This is the first time in the existence of this deck that we've been able to get a turn 4 kill with only 3 cards. So very interesting to note that possibility. All right, so that's pretty much the 1-drops. Let's go ahead to the 2-drops. Now, you guys are very familiar with Harbinger and with Silvergill Adept, so I don't need to say too much about them. I will make one remark on Harbinger of the Tides. Somebody on Reddit asked me if Harbinger was now suboptimal since I'm only running 18 lands. The person asked me, isn't it going to be much harder to cast Harbinger with Flash since you're going to have 4 lands out in fewer instances than when you're running 20 lands in the regular mono blue sort of tempo-oriented build? And it does seem like a reasonable concern, but in my testing so far, it hasn't really come up. And I think the reason is that the most typical applications of Harbinger are to cast it during our main phase, to bounce a creature that's already tapped, sometimes in conjunction with Mara Regery, even though Regery is missing from this particular list. If an opponent has mana dorks, that's often a great target for Harbinger of the Tides. The opponent used the dork for mana on their turn, and we bounce it on our turn. So we only need 2 mana to get Harbinger out. The other common application is to just vial in Harbinger on the opponent's turn frequently during attacks. I find myself, it's definitely the minority of times that I'm casting Harbinger with Flash. I feel like I do that, I don't know, it has to be something like between 5 and 10% of games. It doesn't happen that often because it is a huge commitment of mana. You don't really want to leave up 4 mana to do this with Harbinger if you can use your mana more efficiently on your turn. So I'm still running the full play set because, again, I'm casting him during my turn, I'm getting him in with Aether Vial, and so far he's done a really, really great job. I don't think the fact that I've lowered my land count is going to make me want to lower my Harbinger count, especially since I'm looking to maximize my 2-drops in this deck. Silvergill Adept will never go below 4. In fact, many of us often have fantasized about going above 4. How wonderful it would be if we could play 8 Silvergill Adepts. This guy lets us play a Merfolk, draw a Merfolk, play a Merfolk, draw a Merfolk. That kind of value just leads to winning games against decks like Abzan or Jund that just try to grind us out. It becomes virtually impossible if every single time we play a creature, we draw a creature. It's massive card advantage against their 1-for-1 removal. So the more of these guys we can draw and play, the better chance we have of winning a game. And so when Merfolk Branchwalker was spoiled, a lot of us got really excited and much more inclined to test out this Simic version of Modern Merfolk. So let's take a look at Branchwalker and actually sort of assess how it compares to Silvergill Adept. So looking at the cost, we see it's green and a generic, so super similar to Silvergill Adept, just green instead of blue. Merfolk Scout, instead of, I think, what is it, Merfolk Wizard? Yeah, Merfolk Wizard. So Branchwalker is a scout. Those subtypes don't really come into play very often, or at all, really. And the power and toughness is 2-1. So on its face, very, very similar to Silvergill Adept. Let's go ahead and look at the text and see, how close it actually gets. When Merfolk Branchwalker enters the battlefield, it explores. Now, Explore is one of the new mechanics in Ixalan, and it's a really powerful one. It says, reveal the top card of your library. Put that card into your hand if it's a land. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, then put the card back or put it into your graveyard. So it gives you two options. The first one, revealing the top card and seeing a land, it goes directly into your hand. In those instances, Branchwalker is virtually identical to Silvergill Adept. If there's a land on top of your deck and you cast a Silvergill, you get that land. If you cast Branchwalker, there's a land on top of your deck, you get that land. The only difference with Branchwalker is that Explore reveals the top card, so the opponent knows that you got a land. Whereas with Silvergill, you could potentially bluff something else. But that's a minor difference. In the event that there's a land on top of the deck, Branchwalker is identical to Silvergill Adept. Now, the fact that this deck has 18 lands makes it much more likely that we're going to reveal a non-land off of the deck. Actually, sort of just about 2-1. 2-1 that you're going to hit a non-land. So it's more often that the card is not going, that Branchwalker is not going to draw us a card, that it's going to be the other one. And fortunately, the other mode is amazing. It's super excellent, and I found other people online also just saying, I find myself wanting to not draw a card with Branchwalker more often than I do want to draw a card. So let's look and think about the other mode for a little while here. If you don't see a land, you put a +1/+1 counter on Branchwalker. So it enters the battlefield as a 3/2. So very similar to Comenius Speaker, which enters as a 2/2 for 1 mana, ahead of the curve, so to speak. Branchwalker, many times, most of the time, in fact, enters the battlefield as a 3/2 for 2 mana. So its power is ahead of its casting cost, which allows us to have really explosive, hard-to-answer openings. We can trade more favorably with opponents' creatures if we need to. We can attack into more situations. So it's just felt great when it enters as a 3/2. But that's not it. It doesn't just enter as a 3/2. It gives us the choice of putting the card that we see on top of the deck back on top of the deck and leaving it there as our next draw, or putting it into the graveyard. So scrying is pretty powerful. It's not as powerful in Merfolk as, say, in a deck like Ad Nauseam, where you're really, really trying to basically draw one particular card, right? You get an opening hand and it has a Phyrexian Unlife. You're just going to scry and scry and scry until you get to Ad Nauseam. That's the game plan. That's the way that deck works. Scrying is part and parcel of what it's trying to accomplish. For us, we have so much redundancy. We've got 8 lords, a whole bunch of 2 and 1 drops. It doesn't really matter what we see on top of the deck, so on its face, scrying might not seem very valuable. But let me tell you, it certainly is valuable for us. There are many, many situations where we, in the middle of a game, sort of turn 4, turn 5, we would have drawn an Ether Vial, but Branchwalker, with its ability, its Explore mechanic, lets us throw that Ether Vial in our graveyard. Now, we don't know that the next card in the deck is going to be amazing, but we do know that this Ether Vial was garbage, right? So Branchwalker gets us 1 card closer to spells that will actually help us win the game. So Scry, in that case, is really, really valuable. Another case might be if it's in the middle of the game and you're playing against a creature deck and you see a Curse Catcher. Maybe you think this guy's too little, you don't really want him, you want something more powerful. So scry that guy away. Hopefully you'll draw into a Silvergill or a Lord, something like that. A situation I came across was one where I had a Spreading Seas on an opponent's land, and then I had something like 4 creatures out, and the opponent was at 10 or less life. Now all I needed to draw off the top of the deck was a Lord. So I played a Branchwalker, and it scryed for me. I did see a Lord on top, so I got to leave it. And then next turn, I drew the Lord, and I won the game. If I didn't see a Lord, say I saw a Comenius Speaker, I could have just thrown that in the graveyard, and hopefully the Lord would have been the next card. In any event, if the Lord wasn't the next card, potentially it's the card after that. At any rate, you're getting rid of 1 card that is not going to contribute that much towards your path to victory. So, Branchwalker, 2 options. Option number 1, it's virtually identical to Silvergill Adept, which, as I mentioned, many of us have fantasized about playing more of this card. So Branchwalker does give us access 50% of the time, or no, not 50%, 33% of the time to extra Silvergills. The rest of the time, it's its own very unique card that enters the battlefield as a 3/2 and lets you scry the top of your deck. So both options, extremely powerful. This card has really just been wonderful. I think I need to play more games to really understand, if I've got a Silvergill and a Branchwalker in hand, which one should I get onto the board first? If I've got the option to use Aether Vial, do I want to play Branchwalker first? Do I want to play Silvergill first? What are the pros and cons? Obviously, in a situation where the 3 power immediately would make some kind of difference, you probably want to get Branchwalker on the board. If you really, really need to draw a particular card off the top of the deck, typically something like a Spreading Seas or a Lord, you're probably going to want to play Silvergill Adept, but they actually play really well together, because if you have both in hand, you can play Branchwalker, scry the top card. If you like that card, go ahead and cast Silvergill Adept, and it will draw you that card off the top of the deck immediately. So we've got some really, really excellent 2-drops in the deck right now. Now, moving on to this column, this is basically the Lord column. You guys know the Lord of Atlantis, you know Master of the Pearl Trident, but the newcomer here is Metallic Mimic. So this card replaced Mara Regery for me, based upon the reasoning that, first of all, Mara Regery can be a little bit too slow in a really, really explosive deck that's trying to leverage the advantage of things like a 1-drop 2/2 Merfolk. Metallic Mimic comes down a turn before Mara Regery, and so in that sense, it's a bit faster. Now, the reason that I avoided playing Metallic Mimic up until very recently was it lacks an immediate effect on the board. Right? If we have Aether Vial on 2, we make an attack with a bunch of creatures, the opponent doesn't block, we bring in a Lord with Aether Vial, and that attack goes from being powerful to being lethal. So instantaneous attack. The Lords give our guys +1/+1 right away, right? But if the opponent has a Lightning Bolt or a Fatal Push or a Path to Exile or a Lightning Helix, and they get rid of the Lord, that effect goes away instantaneously, right? So there's a pro and a con to these types of Lords. The pro, obviously, is the immediate effect, the surprise effect. The con is that once they leave the board, their effect ceases to exist in any way whatsoever. So Metallic Mimic is actually sort of an inverse of that. When it comes onto the board, it does not have that immediate effect, which sucks, right? I mean, we really want that, but it compensates for that lack of immediate effect. When it does eventually impart value to the board, that value sticks around even after the Metallic Mimic leaves. So you play this guy, say you played Vial on turn 1, Mimic on turn 2, maybe on turn 2, your Vial has 1 counter, you want to activate it and bring in a Curse Catcher. Your Curse Catcher enters as a 2/2, and even if the Mimic gets removed next turn, the Curse Catcher will always be a 2/2. Comenius Speaker, if you have that instead of Curse Catcher with the Vial, will enter as a 3/3, which is huge. For a 1-drop, it's really absurd. I mean, imagine you play Metallic Mimic, playing against Burn, the opponent attacks with a Goblin Guide, you Vial in Comenius Speaker, and it's a 3/3. And it just eats the Goblin Guide. Now, the opponent probably has a Bolt or something to deal with it, but on its face, getting a 3/3 1-drop is amazing value for us in Merfolk. It changes the game for us. It makes us need to consider different approaches to the deck, and that's what I've been testing. So again, Metallic Mimic on turn 2, bring in a 1-drop, untap on turn 3. If the opponent hasn't played a removal spell on Mimic yet, you're pretty much off to the races, right? You're going to untap, potentially have access to 3 mana and an Aether Vial on 2. Activate Aether Vial, bring in a 2-drop, play another 2-drop with your mana, play another 1-drop. Each one of those creatures has a permanent +1/+1 counter on it that never goes away. Silvergills come in as 3/2s. Branchwalkers can enter the battlefield as a 4/3. Again, this is without Lords. If a Lord comes in, gets removed, it doesn't matter. Branchwalker is always a 4/3. Is basically like a Loxodon Smiter as a 2-drop that can scry for us. I mean, things are changing in Modern Merfolk. This is not a subtle revision of the deck. It's not a tempo deck anymore. It is an aggro deck with tempo elements. We can slow the opponent down with Harbingers. We can slow down their spells with Curse Catcher, but our aggro game is absolutely insane with this particular list. Metallic Mimic has been really impressive so far. In Modern, right now, people don't know this card because nobody plays it. But let me tell you, when the opponent doesn't remove it, I have played Branch Walkers that come in as 3/2s or 4/3s, and the opponent will waste their bolts on a Branch Walker, leaving the Mimic to continue to bring in bigger and bigger guys. No, I don't know if first of all, if Mimic will catch on. Second of all, whether opponents will come to respect the Mimic more than they seem to currently. But this is definitely a card that's worth playing in a tiered Modern deck. It's a super powerful card. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it's an artifact. Doesn't that make it weak to Kolaghan's Command? And the answer, of course, is yes, it does make it weak to Kolaghan's Command. But it improves the deck in certain other situations. It doesn't die to All This Dust. It doesn't die to Whip Flare in Affinity. It doesn't, it does get to block Etch Champion, which is massive against Affinity. In the past, we only really had Mutavaults, and in some decks, I guess, Smuggler's Copter as options as blockers for Etch Champion, since they're colorless. Now we've got 4 Mimics, and it's always great to be able to defend better against Affinity, one of our worst matchups. So yes, Kolaghan's Command, going to be a little bit of a blowout unless we can stop it with things like Dispel or Curse Catcher. But in general, the advantages at least balance out the disadvantages if they don't just outweigh the disadvantages. So Metallic Mimic rounding out our 12 lords in this column here. Over here, we've got the Ether Vials, no explanation necessary. Spreading Seas, same thing, no explanation necessary. So after 18 lands, you've got 32 creatures. It's just a ton. That by itself adds up to 50. Then you've got these 8 non-creatures in Spreading Seas and Ether Vial. That brings us to 58. And leaving 2 flex slots. You guys can see I'm running Spell Pierce. I had considered Blossoming Defense as an option here. Another spicy choice might be Lead the Stampede, which could fill our hand up with 5 Merfolk for 3 mana. But somebody on Reddit mentioned Spell Pierce. Now, I haven't been playing this in Modern Merfolk for a long time because with our tempo build, with Master of Waves and Marijuri and Kira, we're expecting to go fairly late. We're expecting to get into turn 6, 7, 8 in the game pretty regularly. Now, Spell Pierce, once you get to turn 6, 7, 8, is pretty much useless. And I don't like having useless spells in my deck. But in this deck, it goldfishes really, really easily on turn 4. In the real world, with actual removal, it's still on track usually to win by turn 5, or if not that, turn 6. In those kinds of games, Spell Pierce is pretty much always online, right? Even when you get to turn 4 and turn 5, the opponent is casting creatures, right? They're using their mana. They're not going to have 2 mana up to pay for Spell Pierce. And if they do, it'll tap them out. They won't be able to cast multiple pieces of removal. It'll counter Liliana, it'll counter Collected Company, it'll counter Kolaghan's Command, it'll counter Ensnaring Bridge. So having 2 Spell Pierces in a deck that wants to win on turn 4 or turn 5 has been really powerful so far in testing. It actually feels like closer to the application in Legacy, where Spell Pierce is actually a really popular spell because the format can be really fast. So in this really fast deck, Spell Pierce feels extremely powerful, extremely pushed. So yeah, that's where I'm at with this Simic Modern Merfolk deck. It feels great. I think I'm something like 8-2 right now with this particular build, and at least one of the 2 matches that I lost was solely due to the fact that I had only a Cavern and a Mutavault, and I couldn't cast any of my sideboard spells. I would have easily won if the Cavern had been a Fetchland. So you could pretend that I'm 9-1, but the deck feels great. I'm very excited about it. Again, I'm not sure if it's inherently better or more powerful in Modern than the traditional mono blue build, but it feels great, and I can only think that the new cards in Rivals of Ixalan will potentially add to the power of the deck. So looking over here at the sideboard, everything is 1 mana interaction. We've got 6 counter spells, 6 pieces of removal, and 3 Relic of Progenitus. You guys know all about the relics, you know all about the spells, you know all about Ceremonious Rejection. Rejection is amazing against all Tron decks, all Eldrazi decks, all artifact decks. That's a huge swath of Modern, and for 1 mana, it's just incredible. You can counter Ugin the Spear Dragon, an 8-drop for 1 mana, and that'll just win a game by itself. So 3 Ceremonious Rejections, 3 Dispels, helps us against Collected Company decks, helps us against spot removal. Dismember, good against all creatures. Relic of Progenitus, good against anything that cares about the graveyard, from value orientation like Tarmogoyf decks to and Snapcaster decks to combo things like Storm and Gifts Ungiven. Natural State is the spicy addition that green gives us access to. Destroy target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost 3 or less. First thing that jumps to mind with this card is Ensnaring Bridge. How wild is it that that Modern Merfolk can have access to a 1 mana permanent way to remove an Ensnaring Bridge? That card has been one of the banes of our existence since the beginning of the deck. And, we've been able to bounce it for 1 turn with Echoing Truth, or potentially counter it if we're lucky with a Ceremonious Rejection. But Natural State doesn't matter when they play that Ensnaring Bridge. We can just destroy it with Natural State. Other excellent targets. We've got Phyrexian Unlife against Ad Nauseam. It's a 3-drop enchantment. You can kill that thing. There's a bunch of targets against like prison decks. You've got Ghostly Prison. Let's see. Against Burn, there's a couple of variations, but they play Shrine of Burning Rage. You can destroy that thing. It's pretty cool, actually, to destroy that, because if that builds up over a few turns, and then they don't have the 3 mana, I think it's 3 mana, to sacrifice it and actually unload all the damage onto you, you can destroy it, and they've wasted all those turns adding counters onto it. So Shrine of Burning Rage becoming more popular in Burn, but of course, always popular is Eidolon of the Great Revel. Might seem a little bit weird bringing in Natural State to deal with a creature, but that guy is an enchantment creature. And one of the ways that Burn can win most easily against us, Eidolon really cripples our deck, especially if we don't have Ether Vial out, because all of our creatures and spells are, they get burned by Eidolon's ability. So being able to kill that guy for 1 green mana is pretty excellent. Another enchantment creature from, I guess, Theros or that block of note is Courser of Kruphix. I think some Titan decks play Courser of Kruphix. Just some value-oriented decks. I think some of the Bant Nightfall decks run Courser of Kruphix, since they have a lot of land recursion happening with Knight of the Reliquary. They get a ton of incidental life gain off of Courser of Kruphix. So Natural State, a kill spell against Courser also, in addition to Eidolon. So I think that just about does it. I'll try to upload some gameplay for you guys when I have a chance, but I really wanted to share this deck list with you because it feels great. It feels cohesive. It feels explosive. It feels like the mana base works really well. Even though there's 3 Mutavaults, I'm still getting in for a ton of damage with Mutavault. Spell Pierce feels a little bit broken in the list, just feels super strong. And of course, the central aspect of Island Walk in conjunction with Spreading Seas is more often than not coming into play, winning us games. Metallic Mimic, you always want to play first. If the opponent doesn't remove the Mimic right away, you get down a bunch of really big 1-drops and 2-drops. The opponent might eventually deal with the Mimic, but by then, you might have a 3/3 Speaker and a 4/3 Branch Walker. If the opponent has an island or you've given them a Spreading Seas, top deck a Lord, you've got a ton of beef, ton of power on the battlefield, just attack right away and win. Really hard for opponents to resist the power of Island Walk, and these new green creatures are just extra powerful. Their power is ahead of the curve, and yeah, it's just hard to resist. I find that the aggro plan is a lot of fun, and a lot of turn 4 and turn 5 wins so far. Sideboard, really, really efficient, all 1-drops. So let me know your guys' thoughts. Please, if any of you like this list, try it out yourself. Please share some comments on Reddit. There's a ton of testing happening right now. There's a lot of excitement around these new merfolk in Ixalan and what might come out in Rivals of Ixalan. Again, if you'd like to support my channel, please check out the link in the upper right-hand corner to my Patreon page. Thanks as always for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a good day. Bye.